because every time I use the emergency fund, I'm saying to myself, I just had an emergency, right?
Yeah. There's an emotional response to that.
And you have this thing where you're like, well, I'm using that money for the emergency, which is legitimately what it's for. But this fund is for a million different things. And so every time you use it, you're like, what am I jeopardizing in the future? What am I going to need this money for that's coming up? I'm using it now. And then you're just like, you're just spinning because you don't know, like you don't have anything to grab onto. And you just kind of constantly in the cycle of second guessing. I don't know. I just don't think it's a very good way to do it. You are not alone.
No, you are not. Friends, welcome back to another episode. Ben, welcome back to the studio. We haven't been in the studio in a really long time. This is the first one of 2026. We had the live to kick us off, so good to be back. And today we're going to be talking about emergency funds. But before we get into the various stages of emergency funds that YNABers experience, I need an update on the van because I know some things have changed.
Yeah, so to remind you, because we haven't talked about the van situation in a while, back in July, we were literally recording Budget Nerds, and did I have to stop in the middle? Is that what it was?
I think you did. You had to take a call from your mechanic.
Yeah, because, you got to answer the phone when the mechanic calls, otherwise you play phone tag for a million years. So, yeah. So I answered the phone, and I was like, oh, this will be quick. And he was working on my 2005 Toyota Sienna, my old van, over 200,000 miles. And I got a little come to Jesus moment from him where he was basically like, it needs lots of work, and it's maybe time to think about whether you want to keep this van going or not, right? And he's like, he's super nerdy about cars, of course. That's his job. And he's like, I could keep this going forever, but do you want to? And so I decided, it was time to start saving for a new van. And I have a new car category, but it's always like the first thing that I raid whenever I want to do something that I don't have the money for.
Meaning you've always had a new car category, like even before things started going wrong with the van? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But it was like, it had a good chunk of money. I don't remember how much it had in it, but it had a good chunk of money in it back in July. But it wasn't like enough it wasn't even close to buy a new van. And we were going to buy it in cash. And so we were like, okay, well, we have some time, but where we can either decide to pay for all the repairs for this new van or for the old van or buy a new one. And we decided to buy a new one. And the way I pitched it, because Caitlin and I both, like, we just don't really care about cars. It's like,
I get it.
It's like something you have to pay for, but it's just like, it's not something that's important to us. So we were a little grumpy. Both of us were a little grumpy. I was a little more excited because I have to deal with all the problems because it needed work, but it also has just like consistent alignment issues and tires and blah. I'm the one that has to deal with all that. And Caitlin's just like, I don't want to do this. And I'm like, I get it. So I was like, so the way I pitched it, I was like, okay, we're sitting here in July. Why don't we save aggressively for a new van until December? And then in December, we can just kind of get the vibes. And we can decide to spend that money on something else if we want to just fix up the old van. And so we did. And by that time, we did decide to go ahead and get the new van. And yeah, we got it. We got a 2018 Toyota Sienna. So
wow, that is a huge upgrade. So you
honestly
go to 5 from 5 to 13? Or no,
yeah, and I was
18.
From 05 to 18.
Okay.
I was expecting to get like a 2013, 2014, 2015, but ended up where we're at. And let me tell you, Ernie, man, it is slick. It's got like black leather interiors.
Oh man. So you got the heated seats.
The heated seats. It's got a backup camera. It's got Bluetooth. You guys are like, this has been standard for a long time, Ben. Well, not for me. I had to stick a little thing into the cigarette lighter because and that connected to the radio station, so I could connect my phone to the radio station and play it through the radio. I remember one time we were talking about this, and they're like, "Oh, well, you can just get this little device that connects to your aux cable." I'm like, "I don't have an aux cable. This is 2005. Like, come Come on, guys. Anyways, it's built in Bluetooth. There's software. There's backup cameras. It's nice.
Does it have Apple CarPlay?
No, it does not. And I looked into like maybe retroactively putting in there because it does have a little touch screen that I think you can like put the software in there if it's a certain year, but apparently you have to have your phone connected to a wire. I don't know if it's worth it. So anyways, I'm happy with it as it is now, but we'll see.
Man, that's awesome. We have a 2011 Sienna. And that for us was a massive upgrade. I remember the backup camera. I'm like, oh my goodness. And it had the heated seats. And I thought it was the best vehicle I'd ever purchased in my life.
I have run over 2 or 3 kids' bikes. Okay. Like, I have mutilated a couple bikes. So a backup camera, I mean, I don't know. It might not matter if the kids, because the problem is the kids will like leave the bike under the tire of the van. And if I don't look, so the backup camera might not save in that situation, but it at least maybe gives me a chance.
Well, and you're still a youngin', but wait like 8 or 10 years when the neck and back pain comes, where it's just constant.
Oh, I didn't even think about turning around.
Turning around is just like the worst. So yeah, those backup cams can be a real lifesaver. Well, that's awesome. So,
anyway, yeah, it was a saga buying it. Like we looked at so many cars. We drove like 2 hours. Just a quick story. We drove like 2 hours to Burlington to look at this car at this used car lot that was like looking pretty promising. It was a good price, and we got there and turned the thing on, and the engine was making this clicking sound, and I was like, "What's going on?" And so I like took a video of it, and my mechanic was like, "Yeah, you walk away immediately." He's like, "Get out of there." So I was like, oh, okay, that's a bummer. So, we had, it was just a whole saga buying the van, but we got a good one, and it was in town. It was easy. So
nice.
Yeah, just got the title in the mail yesterday. So there you go.
Buying new vehicles, it's a horrible experience for me as well. I just do not enjoy it. Probably because I don't know anything about vehicles. I feel so dumb throughout the entire process.
I hate it. I honestly, I don't enjoy the process, but we got it done. I do enjoy the results. So, and
awesome.
I did enjoy putting down a giant chunk of change because we bought it in cash. But it was worth it. So, and like I said in the live, I think our age of money went from like 110 to like 66 days or something. But that's okay. That's fine.
That's okay. The money did what it was supposed to do. Exactly. Yes, what it was for.
Exactly what it was for. And there we go.
Well, I know we're going to come back to that story.
Yes.
Because there's something tied to emergency funds with it, and we'll get into that. But we're talking emergency funds today. We're talking about the various stages that YNABers go through with their emergency fund, if they have an emergency fund at all. So why this topic? Why right now?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for, about 6 months or so, because I feel like for a long time, YNAB and the YNAB method has had a weird relationship with emergency funds.
Totally.
You know what I mean? Because like we're kind of like, we see the value of an emergency fund. But we also have this thing where we save for specific non-monthly expenses, and we try to anticipate any emergency that you can. And I've experienced this in my own life too. The more you use YNAB, the less often you have those emergencies because you're saving for them. And so I feel like we've kind of had a thing where we're just kind of like, emergency funds are fine, but you don't really need them with YNAB. But like we haven't really landed in a good place. And I think we talked about this on stage at Minneapolis Fan Fest a while back. And it was a little wishy-washy. We're like, do what you want, And then somebody came up to me, and I'm so sad. I wish I had written down your name because you really got me thinking. So if you are watching this, if you talk to me about emergency funds at the Minneapolis Fan Fest, leave a comment or email us at budgetnerds@ynab.com. I really want to thank you again because you really got me thinking about this. You said, what they said was, it's really, I think YNABers go through stages of needing an emergency fund less and less over time. And I think that's really the key. I think I'm trying to uncomplicate our relationship with emergency funds a little bit and be like, this is actually what's going on. And then it really becomes something else completely in the end. And I think I want to talk about that. So yeah. So I thought what we do today is we would talk about the old emergency fund mindset. Like this is a absolute staple of personal finance blogosphere land, right?
Absolutely.
Advice been around forever. And then we'll talk about how we do it a little bit differently. And we'll talk about these stages of emergency funds, how YNABers kind of change their relationship with emergency funds. And then I have a recommendation for you at the end if you're one of those people that is kind of in the late stage emergency fund land as a YNABer. So yeah, so that's what we want to talk about today.
All right, so the old emergency fund mindset. If I go back all those years, I graduated college, I was starting to get serious about being an adult. So I was interested in personal finance. I started reading a ton of books. And I'm pretty sure that having an emergency fund is the first thing that I learned. Like it's non-negotiable. If you want to take your money seriously, you got to have an emergency fund. And I even think there was a number attached. It was $1,000. Have $1,000 emergency fund. So in my mind, the best that I can remember, that was my first financial goal.
Yeah, and it's funny because I feel like the $1,000 starter emergency fund advice has been around for like 30, 40 years, and it's like, well, what about inflation? Because $1,000 isn't what it used to be, right? But yeah, it's true. It's like you have this big fund of cash for everything, for anything that doesn't happen on a regular basis, right? And well, I feel like there's a couple. Okay, so for one thing, I think this is good because it's a starter point toward, evening out the ups and downs of cash flow problems in your life, right? But I do think there's a lot of problems with it. One, I do think it leads to. Okay, well, it can lead to peace of mind for some people, but I think it can also lead to this kind of nagging anxiety. Like, how do you ever really know if you have enough? Because you look at this big fund of cash and it's for everything. It can be for anything. Like you kind of multiply in your head. Well, it's like, oh, well, I gotta, if I have a car repair, well, I got that $1,000. And then it's like, well, if my vet needs to go to the emergency, or my pet needs to go to the emergency vet, well, I got that $1,000. And it's like, oh, well, if my boiler breaks, well, I got that $1,000, right? And it's just like, okay, but what if all these things happen at once? You know what I mean? And I feel like you can just get to this place where it's just like, well, the only answer, because I can't figure it out, the only answer is just to save more and more and more and more. And then you get to like, oh, well, I need 3 months of expenses, or I get 6 months of income. Like people go wild with this emergency fund because they're trying to solve this problem of, I don't actually know what the money's for by just putting more and more and more in there. And it's never really enough. The amount becomes really arbitrary and confusing, right?
Yeah, I totally remember that tension. On one hand, there was that peace of mind because I had never had an emergency fund before. And every time something would pop up, I was just making up a plan on the spot for how I was going to deal with it. So seeing that amount, and I don't know, we might have even went half of it. We might have said, let's start with 500,
right.
But whether it's 500 or 1,000, doesn't matter. We had this pot of money for emergencies. And I remember thinking, okay, that feels good. Something happens, we can cover it. But
so much better than nothing, right?
Better than nothing.
Yeah. And
but
you feel
then
good at
on
first.
the other hand, like what you were saying, it was, okay, what if this all happens at once? Because once I got that amount, 500 or 1,000, whatever it was, it's like I stopped saving for those things. And then my focus turned to debt. So there was that other piece of like, oh my goodness, if these all hit at once, or if something is really massive, we're screwed.
Yeah. It also, I think it can lead you to kind of fib a little bit to yourself about your cash flow, like about your monthly cash flow, right? Because the fact is, every month there's one of these emergencies that you would need to tap your emergency fund for, like every single month. So you're always, okay, well, every single time I use it, the idea is you're supposed to save to fill it back up, right? And then you're like, but now I can't get to paying off debt. I can't get to this other financial goal that I have. And it's because the fact is your cash flow situation isn't considering non-monthly expenses, because you're like, well, I got the $1,000 emergency fund, I'm good. And it's like, well, no, you have the $1,000 emergency fund, and every single month you're having to refill it because you're always going to have a non-monthly expense every month, right?
Well, that's the thing. I didn't realize at the time that those aren't actually emergencies.
Right. That's the key, yeah.
My vehicles are always going to need repairs. We're always going to be going to the doctor. We're always going to need to replace new clothes. The hot water heater is going to go out. Like something's going to go wrong with the house. Those are just expected expenses. They're not emergencies.
Yeah. And I mean, all the examples we're giving are like unpredictable. Like you don't know, in the sense of like you don't know how much it's going to cost or when it's going to happen. But people use emergency funds for predictable stuff. Like, you know, people will say, oh, well, I had a car insurance bill that was due every 6 months, and so that's an emergency. So they use the emergency fund, right? Or worse, they say, well, I'm going to have this credit card only for emergencies. But they are like, oh, well, it was obviously an emergency. I had to pay the car insurance bill. And it's like, well, no, it's not an emergency. Like, you know, so like emergencies aren't well defined either. So that's another problem, is like you don't really have a good sense of what an emergency is. It's just anything that you didn't think about. Well, but if you had thought about it and you saved for it, it wouldn't be an emergency. You would just think of it like an expense, right? And so if you have this catch-all emergency fund that's supposed to cover everything, unpredictable things and even predictable things, you kind of constantly, it does something psychologically. You're always tapping the emergency fund. You're like, man, I'm just always having these emergencies. My life is just stressful all the time, right? Because I'm sorry, I'm just thinking through it as I go, and that's what we do at Budget Nerds. Because every time I use the emergency fund, I'm saying to myself, I just had an emergency, right?
Yeah. There's an emotional response to that.
And you have this thing where you're like, well, I'm using that money for the emergency, which is legitimately what it's for. But this fund is for a million different things. And so every time you use it, you're like, what am I jeopardizing in the future? What am I going to need this money for that's coming up? I'm using it now. And then you're just like, you're just spinning because you don't know. Like you don't have anything to grab onto. What is it that's coming up? I don't know. And do I have the money for it? I don't know. And you just kind of constantly in the cycle of second guessing. I don't know. I just don't think it's a very good way to do it.
It isn't a good way to do it. There's zero control, zero clarity, and zero confidence.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why we do it differently at YNAB.
Exactly. So instead of just one emergency fund for all of it, we think about all of those possible quote unquote emergencies, and we don't treat them like emergency. We treat them like expenses. We treat them like bills that we expect and that we plan for.
It's going to happen.
Yeah. And I think it can be painful at first to admit, yeah, you know what? I don't have as much cash flow as I thought I did because I have to save for these things. Because you're kind of admitting, yeah, this emergency fund thing it's not enough. I need to actually use my monthly cash flow to prepare for these things rather than having a big old fund of savings to prepare for these things. And yeah, but that's what we do. But so it can be kind of a bummer at first, and you're like, man, I have to admit this. But then once you do it, all of a sudden over time, you stop having emergencies at all. And there's such a huge psychological shift. You just go through life and you have expenses, but you don't have emergencies. Right. It's exactly the same thing. It's just what you call it. Right.
Yeah. I mean, we hear this all the time from YNABers. They're like, oh, a huge tree fell on my house, but no big deal.
Yeah.
Or I had this big car repair and I just paid it. So, I mean, it's not fun paying for these things, but they don't become financial emergencies. They don't become these hair on fire situations where you're just scrambling, trying to figure out how you're going to address the situation. It's life. You're living life.
Yeah. I think Jesse had a good turn of phrase with this. He said, before YNAB, inconveniences are emergencies. But after YNAB, emergencies are inconveniences, right? Where it's just, I mean, like nobody likes having to deal with the car breaking down or the tree hitting your house. Like it's a headache, right? But it's not a pants on fire situation. It's not a financial problem, right? I mean, there's still all the emotions of bad things happening to you, but you don't have this financial issue on top of it, right? And I think if you even with the emergency fund, I mean, like you could say, well, oh, you know, all the same things are true if you cover it with an emergency fund, and that's true. But there's this psychological aspect of you're still calling it an emergency, and you feel like you're this victim of the
Yes.
the horrors of life, right? Because you're calling it emergency every single time, and you're like, I have an emergency every single month. What the heck? What's going on, right? And you start to realize, oh, actually, no, these things aren't emergencies. They're just life. They're just expected. And if you make that a part of your cash flow, rather than relying on this arbitrary large fund, it can make life a lot more chill. I would just put it that way.
So much more chill. This idea of every single month setting money aside for your non-monthlies, it was revolutionary for me. Like, it was the reason I had 100% buy into YNAB, where I'm like, this is it. This is the system I am going to use forever, because it gave me the clarity. Like, I could see my 20 or 30 non-monthlies that I knew eventually at some point this year, I'm going to pay for these things. Mm-hmm. It gave me confidence. I could see exactly how much money I had available in those areas. And also I had this idea of, okay, if a whole bunch happen at once, or one really big expense happens, I've got some wiggle room here. I can make adjustments. I can move money between my categories and still pay for it. And then it also gave me the clarity, confidence, control, mm-hmm. right? Because I was being intentional. Every single time I got paid, I was setting a little bit aside for these non-monthlies. And that just made me feel like I've got this. Like, I'm in the driver's seat now. Car repair, I see you coming in 9 months. I'm going to be ready for you.
Well, that's the other thing too, is the control of it. You interface with these expenses on a monthly basis instead of interfacing with them when they happen, right? And so you actually can ask yourself, do I value this? Like, this is costing me, you know exactly how much it's costing you in like a more manageable chunk of money, like in a more like, it's, you can kind of wrap your hands around it, instead of saying like, well, I have to, my car breaking down, my auto maintenance is costing me, I don't know, some giant amount of money every once in a while. You're saying, okay, my auto maintenance is costing me $150 a month, right? And so you can say, okay, do I value this car enough to put that much to it? Or even like subscriptions, like a yearly software subscription or something like that. Instead of interfacing with that once a year, and you say, okay, you might not even know how much it costs you because you're not keep paying attention to that. You're not keeping track of that. And you say, oh, this thing is costing me, some amount every year, and that's a headache. Instead, you say every month, okay, I'm putting $10 aside for this every month. Do I value that $10 worth? Right. And so I think because you interact with it more often, you have more of a sense of how much you value that thing and whether or not you want to change it. And that can be really powerful too.
Yeah. All right. So sum this up for YNABers. Instead of saving for an emergency fund, you're going to be saving for very specific non-monthly expenses, non-monthlies that are both predictable and unpredictable.
Yeah,
correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Although the question is like,
I guess,
is there any worth in having both though? Like having an emergency fund and also saving for these non-monthly things, right? Because I think this is the crux of it. Like when we at YNAB, like we see there's value in having a big chunk of change just hanging out for something that goes wrong. But we also see immense value in non-monthly. In fact, we insist on it, right? And so I think this is where it leads to this question, like, do YNABers even need an emergency fund? And I think we've waffled on that back and forth a little bit over the years. Like I remember when Jesse came out with the book back in, was that 2017? It's like a million years ago now, right? He put in there like kind of a provocative statement, you don't need an emergency fund. And that was like in interviews and stuff. And I think that was just kind of his way to be like, it's provocative because it's that's like if there's any principle in personal finance, like that's it, right? And so to say that is kind of intense.
Yeah.
And but what he meant was, well, you need to stay for these individual things instead. And I feel like ever since then we've been kind of waffling on like, well, there's a place for emergency fund, but maybe not. It just depends. But when this YNABer came up to me in Minneapolis, I feel like he really set me on a path that that solved it for me. I think your need for an emergency fund goes down the more you use YNAB. And so I think there's different stages that YNABers go through.
Yeah, thinking back to my own YNAB story, so I had that emergency fund and I came into YNAB with that emergency fund. And I kept that emergency fund while also saving for my non-monthlies. Now, I'm not sure why I did that. Because looking back, and this is how I would advise people now, I would say, hey, just ditch the emergency fund.
Okay.
Just take that amount of money
and separate it.
And separate it. Spread it across all of your non-monthly expenses. But I'm wondering, why didn't I do that back in the day? And I'm guessing I was scared.
Yeah, well, I think there's a very rational reason. Is because you're just getting started with this, and you don't know what you don't know yet, right? And so, yeah, I think it's understandable to be a little worried about it. So I think this is the first stage. So we'll get into the. I think there's 3 stages of an emergency fund, of a YNABer's relationship with an emergency fund. The first stage is, I think you actually do still need the emergency fund, because when you first start, you're going to think about non-monthly expenses, but you're not going to get the amounts right. You're going to miss a lot of them, right? I think there's still a lot of value in having a fund to cover those things that you forgot. And we actually have a category called stuff I forgot, right? As the default in YNAB. So you could think of that as like this emergency fund. It's just kind of yes, you're going to start this process of saving for non-monthly expenses, but it doesn't happen all at once because you forget stuff. And also, it takes a while to really, like I talked about, you kind of have to admit that your cash flow situation isn't as free as you might think, because you need to save for these things every month. And so, I talk about the Christmas, for example. It took me a long time to just buckle down and say, you know what, I need to save for Christmas every month, right? Because I would get an extra paycheck. I get 3 paychecks a month in October, and I would always use that for Christmas, right? And that was fine for a while, but I was just like, I want to use that money for something else. I want to use it for what I want in the moment. So instead I said, okay, I'm going to admit that my cash flow needs to be less, so I can put more toward Christmas, and then I can use that money for whatever else, right? So that's like one example, like the quintessential non-monthly expense, right? The holidays, I wasn't even saving for. It took me years to get there. So I think sometimes you forget stuff, but also sometimes it just takes you a little while to make that transition in your life. And that's the first stage. You still kind of need that emergency fund as a place to fall back on when your expenses get overwhelmed because you didn't save enough, or you just hadn't admitted that you needed to save for that one particular expense, right?
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense, because when I started YNAB, right away I knew, okay, this is better than what I was doing before, like in terms of the clarity and the confidence with the specific non-monthlies. But it wasn't like I had the clarity that I have now. I was kind of figuring out what those non-monthly expenses were as I was going about things. So there was still this, like, yes, I was more confident, but I wasn't as confident as I am 13 years later. So I think it makes sense that I hung on to that emergency fund just because I couldn't see the full picture quite yet. It took a couple years for me to get to that point.
Yeah. So first stage is you still need it, or there's still a lot of value in it, just because, I'll just put it this way. This is a major life change. Like going from not saving for non-monthly expenses at all to making that a part of your regular monthly cash flow it's a big shift. It's a big mindset shift. And I think it takes a lot of YNABers years to fully get there. And that's okay. Like, I don't want to say like you have to be you have to follow this plan perfectly from day one, because it's a journey. That's why I love Budget Nerds so much, is we are talking to people who have been using YNAB for years. And if you're new, welcome. But a lot of the folks that watch this show have been using YNAB for a long time, and there's still new things to learn along the way, right? And I've been using it for every single time I say this, I have to like do the math. I'm like, what? I've been using it this will be 13 years this year. Yeah.
Okay, well then I've been lying, because I'm 1 year behind you. So if you're 13, I'm 12.
I started
so
in 2013, I think. Yeah, I did. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
that'll be right. Yeah.
I apologize, folks. I've been only using it 12.
Every time I'm like, I have to do the math. Yeah, 13 years this year, and I'm still learning stuff. I'm still changing things. So it's a journey.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the first
Okay.
stage.
So yeah. So if you're new to YNAB and you already have that emergency fund, you're just going to bring it on over.
Yeah.
If you're new to YNAB and you don't have an emergency fund, you might want to think seriously about starting one just for these beginning stages. Now, you would probably agree, we're not going to put an amount on what that emergency fund should be. I mean, it's going to be different for everyone.
Yeah.
I would just say, what makes you feel better at night?
Yeah. What helps you sleep?
Or what makes you sleep better at night?
Exactly.
Not feel better. You're going to be sleeping. Yeah.
Yeah. And then stage 2 is a transition phrase where you're going to look up and see, I need this emergency fund less and less. Like you're going to start looking at that emergency fund and say like, what else could I do with that money? Because maybe you haven't used it at all for a couple of years. Or maybe you can look back and say, I only tapped that emergency fund like twice in the past like 4 years or something like that, right? And you might start, if you start feeling a little antsy, like what's this money even for? That's when you're in this new stage. You start to not need it as much, but you're still not quite sure because there's kind of a little bit of latent anxiety of letting that go, right? Would you agree with me, Ernie, on that?
100%. So I don't know what the time frame was, if this was 2 years, 5 years, but I remember getting to that point where I'm like, I'm not using this as much. I had really gotten dialed in on what my non-monthly expenses were. And I was just every single month putting a little bit aside for those things. So I could see that over time, my savings was increasing. And what that meant is that emergency fund wasn't giving me as much peace of mind as it was before.
Yeah.
In fact, it got to the point where, like you said, I was like, is there a better use of this money?
Yeah.
Because it is just, it's sitting there, no purpose, no emotional value whatsoever. What else could I do? And that's when I decided to then use that emergency fund to complete the getting a month ahead process.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's the signal for you. If you're looking at your emergency fund and you're like, why do I have this chunk? Like, what can I do? What else could I do with that? You might be making this transition because you don't have emergency fund, or you don't have emergencies anymore. You have all the same bad things that happen to you all the time, all these things that need a lot of money, but they don't feel like emergencies because you expected them, right? And then you get into stage 3 of a YNABer's relationship with an emergency fund, where you don't need an emergency fund at all, at least not in the sense of this like slush fund for whatever random thing that comes up, right? And that's when, for you, Ernie, you took it and you moved it to get a month ahead. Like you actually use that money. Or maybe you take the money and you move it around to a bunch of different categories. So you break it up into more specific categories. But I do think that there is a role of having not an emergency fund in this stage, but having a pretty big chunk of change in a single category. And I think what I think it is it changes from this slush fund of like lots of different purposes to one purpose. And that is a job loss fund. I think that's the point where you're like, okay, I don't need it for random emergencies, but I do need it for one big emergency. And that's if I had an interruption in my income due to a job loss or something like that. And I think that's really the key is when you're like, yeah, that's what, if there's a one thing that I need like 3 months of expenses saved up for, that's what it's for. It's for a job loss. I think that's the last big, scary emergency that you might want what looks like an emergency fund for, right?
I think you're absolutely right. And you floated this idea. It might even have been years ago. In fact, I think it was years ago, early on in Budget Nerds. I think it came from you. And I was like, oh, that's what my plan is missing. Because when I transitioned from an emergency fund to a month ahead, I didn't have any sort of other additional fund for that one big thing that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. And then you said, oh, every YNABer needs like a job loss fund.
Yeah.
Like that's the last kind of stage. I was like, oh, that makes total sense. And so I created a job loss fund, and it's very tough to fund.
Yeah.
Because I've mentioned this before. I know Christy and I are both full-time. We're both employed. And I don't know.
Stable,
like
right?
there's just there's just no urgency to fill that up.
This is exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, like if you weren't saving for non-monthlies and you were like, I need an emergency fund, you would feel like pants on fire. I got to fund that because it's for all these little different things. Now you don't need an emergency fund, but you do realize, oh yeah, there's a good purpose in a job loss fund, but you're not pants on fire about that situation because of your circumstances, right? And so instead of looking at the emergency fund and saying this could be for anything, this is the problem I have with an emergency fund. It doesn't have you're not giving every dollar a job, right? It's not one clear purpose, right? But a job loss fund is one clear purpose. And I think that makes all the difference, because a lot of you guys might be saying, Ben, what the heck? Like, you've been telling me you're going to make this big transition to no longer needing an emergency fund, and then you're going to end it with, well, actually, you do need an emergency fund, but you just give it a different name. Like, it feels kind of arbitrary, right? But I don't think it is. I think naming it what it actually is, a job loss fund, it makes all the difference. It has a lot of the same characteristics of an emergency fund. Like it might be a pretty big chunk of change compared to saving for auto maintenance, right? So it might be a large amount of money, and it might be based on a certain number of months of expenses. So you might say, oh, a job loss fund needs like 3 months of expenses for me, right? And people, when you talk about emergency funds, people often use those terms. They speak of it in terms of number of months of expenses. So I think it has similarities in that way. But if you name it what it is, this is specifically for a job loss, then you can actually start making decisions with it. It doesn't feel like this sacred cow of like, I can't touch it unless it's like some kind of emergency, which I haven't even really well defined, right? Instead, it's you can use it for whatever you want, depending on your situation with how you're interfacing with your income, right? And so I think there's a lot of power in that, and just giving it a name, a specific name, one thing. This is a job loss fund.
Yeah. That's what we have. And I'll admit it, our job loss fund is a little bit like your new vehicle fund, where we take from it kind of regularly, but I'm still trying to slowly build it up over time. And in the back of my head, I know that this is also going to be the fund I'm going to use if there's something major, like a major medical problem or a major home repair. It's going to come from that.
Yeah, but here's the deal: is like, you could take it from there, but you know what you're giving up,
right? Exactly.
Like we are huge fans at YNAB of changing your plan, right? What changes do I need to make, if any? That is like one of the key questions that we ask ourselves over and over again. And the problem with taking it out of an emergency fund is I don't know what I'm giving up. I don't know what the trade-off is. It's just a vibe of emergencies, right? Yep. But if you choose to take the money out of a job loss fund, you know exactly what you're giving up. You're saying, okay, well, if I take it out of here, if I lose my job, or if I have some kind of interruption in my income or my partner's income or whatever, I won't have as much money to help me float that. And then you can actually make a choice. You can say, well, my industry is getting weird and storm clouds are coming on the horizon. I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to take out of the job loss fund. In fact, I might want to put more money in there.
Yeah.
Or you can say, my job is very stable. Things are fine. I feel good about taking the money out of the job loss fund and using it for something else. And I'm going to do that, right? You know exactly what you're giving up. Because I think if you give that, this is why category names, like we joke about them a lot, like we're like but I really do think they matter a lot, because if you name the category and you have really specific rules for what that money is for, when you decide to make changes to your plan, you actually know what the trade-off is. You know what you're giving up. Emergency funds just too vague. Job loss funds are much more specific. And I did this with the van. That's why I wanted to talk about the van before we got here. So I needed to save. Okay, I'll just tell you. I spent $21,000 on this van. I plopped it down, right? That is so much money. Like, I'm pretty sure that's like not that far off from like the down payment on the house I made in 2015.
Did you just write a personal check for it?
It was a wire transfer.
Okay.
Like, just sent it. And actually, it was a whole thing because it like wasn't working in the office. And the guy that was selling to me, he was nice enough. He's like, just take the van home and try the wire transfer at home and let me know. And I was like, that's really nice. Because I was like, I'm stranded here. Like, my wife dropped me off. Anyways, yeah. And so we needed to save a lot. So I had like, I don't remember. I think I had like a couple thousand in a new car category. We saved pretty much everything extra we had. We went to it for 6 months, but we still didn't have enough. And we were kind of getting to a point where it's like, okay, we need to either like fix this old van or we need to get a new van because I didn't want to put any money into the old van. And I was like, okay, well, I have this emergency fund. I have, a month ahead, I save for non-monthly expenses. I also have this emergency fund, but because I'd been thinking about this, I had very recently changed the name of it to a job loss fund. Right. And I said, okay, I'm going to take that money and I'm going to put that on the van. And if it was called an emergency fund, I don't think I would have had I don't think I would have felt good about it because again, it's just like, what am I giving up? I don't know.
You're doing something wrong.
I might have still done it, but I would feel anxious about it.
Sure,
right? Because it's like, what is it for? Like, what am I hadn't given those dollars a clear job. When I gave it the job of job loss fund, all of a sudden the decision completely changed. I said, okay, what am I giving up if I use this money right now for the van? Well, I'm giving up a few months of safety in the event of a job loss, right?
Yep.
Of like total peace of mind in the event of job loss. And some of you guys are like, that's not worth it for me at all, right? Like, I would fix the new van and keep going and save longer. For me, I was looking at my wife's job, I was looking at my job, and I'm like, you know what? I think things are pretty stable. I feel really good. And I know that we can refund this job loss fund in a certain amount of months. I'm going to go ahead and take it and get the van now. And I felt completely fine. I felt completely justified and completely safe doing that because I knew exactly what the trade-off was, right? There's a lot of power in that. And we are now refunding that job loss fund. So, yeah. So, but it wasn't in isolation either. It's also like, well, we're 2 months ahead. We are saving for all these non-monthlies, right? All these things came together where I felt good about taking money out of the job loss fund. But if it was called an emergency fund, I don't think I would have felt good about it. I wouldn't know what it's for. So it makes a huge difference there.
Love it. One other thought I had in why I think it should be named the job loss fund is realizing that's 100% on me and Christy. Like, we are carrying all that risk. Whereas, we have medical insurance, we have car insurance, we have home insurance. So somebody else is also sharing the risk of something major happening. Mm-hmm. But like the job loss, that is all on us. So it is
not really a way to insure your income. Like, it probably is, but
right. There's insurance for everything.
If there's a risk, there's somebody will sell you insurance for
right?
It, right.
But no,
I think
thank you.
That's actually a really good way to think of it. Is like, this is insurance money.
Yeah,
you can think of it that way, and then you don't feel bad about like this money has no purpose. Like, because if you're in stage 3 of your relationship with a emergency fund as a YNABer, you might be looking at the emergency fund and be like, I don't really know what the purpose of this money is. Like, why can I just use it for something else? Instead, you say, oh, it's for a job loss. You can kind of quiet that concern that specific need is covered. And that will give you, I think, even more peace of mind if you give it a real job. It all comes back to that principle of give every dollar a job. Ask yourself, what's this money for, and give it a real purpose. I think that is really the core of this. Is the emergency fund's too vague, and once you get to a point where you don't need this large slush fund for quote unquote emergencies, give it a really clear job. It's a job loss fund. That's what it is.
Yep. And one other thought here. And this is specific to YNABers. And actually, I heard it from our very own Ashley G and Hannah. Heard it from Hannah, where you don't need that job loss category. Instead, you could assign all that job loss money to future months.
Yeah, that's true.
And I've heard that people do that so that they know exactly if something were to happen today, like if we were both to lose our jobs, how long can that job loss money last us? And they could instantly go forward 5 months and be like, oh, we can get 5 and, a quarter months of expenses paid for.
Yeah, that's right. Hannah was talking about how she just took the money and it was the same amount of money. She just took the money and put it forward into future months, and it just gave her a ton of peace of mind. Like,
can you imagine
awesome.
being able to flip forward 6 months?
Yeah.
I mean, that would make assigning a little bit weird. Like I get paid, today, but I'm not funding it till like July.
There's like mechanical software reasons why I don't want to do it that way. But like, but for some of you guys, you're like, that would give me a lot of peace of mind. Maybe not even the whole plan, but like the basics. Like you can think of like these are the bare bones categories that I have to fund, and you could fund those for 6 months or 3 months or whatever you want, and just prove to yourself, oh, I'm going to be okay in the event of a job loss, right? And I think everybody should do this, whether you actually assign money into the future or if you have a job loss fund, just make yourself like a bare bones plan. Like this is, in the event of I lost my job, these are the things I would spend money on, and these are the things I wouldn't. These are the amount I would reduce my groceries by this amount, right? Like get a plan based on that, and then just calculate, okay, this is the amount of money I have, and this is how long it's going to last me. And do I feel good about that? If the answer is yes, your job loss fund's complete. If the answer is no, maybe you should save a little more for it, right?
And a great way to create that bare bones plan in case of this type of emergency is the focused views. A lot of YNABers will create a focused view for the essentials in case of an emergency.
I love that. I need to do that. I haven't done that. I think it's a really good idea because it just gives you, like, if you're ever feeling a little anxious, you can just click that little button, that little focus view, and look at it and say, okay. And you could just do that calculation. Say, I have this job loss fund for this amount. With this bare bones plan, it's going to last me for a while. And I had that when Caitlin lost her job a few years back. That's exactly what we did. We had the emergency fund, which is what I called it at the time. I'm grateful I had it, even though it was really a job loss fund. And we also were saving for a renovation. So we just like didn't spend that money, right, until we got a new job. And we also had month ahead money, and we had all this money that we were giving away that, we had the bare bones plan, and we're like, we can last for 6 months on this and be fine. And it totally changed Caitlin's job search. Like, she was not anxious about finding a new job. She turned down a job offer because it wasn't right, Whereas if we hadn't done that calculation, or we didn't have that money, she might have just taken a job that wasn't right for her,
Yeah.
So it changes your whole mindset. It changes everything. So there's a lot of value in the job loss fund, but I think there's a lot of value in calling it what it is. It's a job loss fund. Now, this is assuming you have been using YNAB for a little while and you feel like you don't need that emergency fund anymore. Because some of you guys, I'm sure you're like, well, I still feel like I need it. And that's totally natural and normal because it takes a long time. It takes a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of thinking to get to the point where you don't have emergencies anymore because you're saving for everything you could possibly think of, right? And at that point, you'll get to that point where you can really just change the name of that emergency fund to a job loss fund, or use it for something else. If you don't think you need that job loss fund, or you don't think you need as much as you have in there for a job loss fund purpose, do what Ernie did. Get a month ahead with it, or buy a new car with it, right? I will be refunding the job loss fund because I do think that's needed. But it's nice to be able to make the choice to use it for something else for a time, right? So a lot of power there.
All right, friends, your turn. What are your thoughts on the emergency fund, the stages of an emergency fund that we outlined? What are your thoughts on job loss fund? What do you call your job loss fund in your plan? Let us know in the comments or email us at budgetnerds@ynab.com. But before we let you go, we got to share a couple YNAB wins. Let's do it.
All right, we got an email from Billy who wrote this. My favorite win with YNAB is how it's helped me align my budgeting with my values. especially when it comes to generosity. Aside from giving to the church, being generous doesn't come naturally to me. But once I realized my budget didn't reflect who I wanted to be, I was able to adjust things. I love this. For example, I live in an expensive area and groceries are sky high. $7 for a gallon of milk. Oh no, that's like twice.
Yikes.
I wonder if you're in Hawaii or something like that. Anyways, so I created a hospitality category to make it easier to have guests over without worrying about it derailing my grocery budget. Love that. We also have a special giving category, which allows us to support everything from a friend's medical needs to giving during global crises. We've also set aside funds for monthly donations to charities we believe in. None of these amounts are huge, but having the money set aside makes it so much easier to move toward the values we aspire to. And then she wrote, "Isn't that cool?" Yes, Billy, that is cool.
So cool.
I love that. Yeah, I think it's so true. Like, you can be a more generous person because you've decided that's what the money's for, and then you can just freely spend it on people. It's awesome.
Kelly emailed us probably about a year ago. Oh, this is perfect timing. My age of money plummeted, and I couldn't be more excited.
That's that's the title for a blog post right there. I just want to say, Kelly, that's good marketing right there. Good job. All right.
I moved to my current city in 2021, and since then, I've been saving up to buy a house. Whenever I got birthday money, a bonus, or any little bump, a portion always went to my down payment category, and I watched the category and my age of money go up. 150 days, 200 days, all the way to 345 days. Holy cow.
Wow.
That's one of the highest I've ever seen. And I had a lot of time to save because I was on the house hunt for almost 18 months.
Wow.
I started to think that maybe it wouldn't be possible for me to buy a house on a single income, especially when interest rates went above 8%. Yikes. But I found the perfect house a day before Thanksgiving, closed a day before New Year's Eve, and kicked off 2025. Okay, so this was probably exactly a year ago.
Love it.
And kicked off 2025 with a house of my own. At first, looking at my net worth report was terrifying. I've never done a fresh start, and I live for the data. I get that. I'm starting to get that. But I reminded myself that this was the whole point. The point of saving is to spend on the things that are important to you. And being able to buy a house by myself was the perfect reflection of my values. Thank you, YNAB. Well, my goodness, thank you, Kelly, for sharing that. And are you in marketing or something? Because
there's some bangers in here.
we could not have said that better ourselves. So I'm not even going to elaborate. I'm just going to say fantastic job, and we're super excited for you.
Love it, Kelly. Well, if you have a YNAB win, you can put it in the comments, or you can email us at budgetnerds@ynab.com, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Until next time.
We'll see you in 2 weeks, because Ben, you're sharing your categories.
That's right. My categories.
And I've got some questions for you.
All right. Let's do it.
See you then. Take care. Happy YNABing.
Happy YNABing.